Okay, let me test that. That should be good now. I must have bumped the mic. So that ought to work. Important. Even a congregation that we spoke at and did a little bit of work and service at, Tree of Life Congregation.
Test that. That should be good now.
Actually
I must have bumped the
went
mic.
ahead and advertised
So that
this a
ought to
little.
work. Important. Even a congregation that we spoke at and
I'm gonna. There we go. I'm getting a little bit of echo here. So I'm going to lower things a little. This is not the night for this, but I would expect this. Okay. That should. Yeah. Is everybody else hearing the echo or is it just me this evening? I'm just doing a double check here. Okay. That seems to sound better. Okay. Um, good. Well, we're going to get started here. There we go. That's better. Okay. We had a secondary mic system, and so I could hear myself. That's distracting. So you guys weren't hearing it, but I was, and that kind of makes me a little weird because it sounds like there are two of me, and one of me is quite enough. So we're not going to go ahead and create cloning this evening, and so I had to kind of deal with that. So good. Um, we're going to take a little bit of a listen. Now, there's going to be a long clip from Rabbi Tovia. And so I've set that up um, in such a way that people will be aware if they come in that that is indeed him. I'm not endorsing his views. I believe in being intellectually honest. So before we deal with his arguments, I feel that it is proper and right to give him his say. It The language should be better on this one, but the material probably will rankle those who can see that there are probably problems with it. But then we can dissect the views and go ahead and look at them. So I'm going to go to the PowerPoint now um, and put this up and pull some other things. Well, I can't totally pull it down, but let me pull it over. And we're going to get started with the PowerPoint and just get started. Now, wanted to have a little fun with this. So hopefully there'll be a little animation. Um, but I wanted to get started here. Now, we're going to be hearing Rabbi Tovia on one of his latest broadcasts. And so bear with it. It's good. You need to hear what he's saying so that we can dissect it. And for those who may be of his opinion, who may join us, it is perfectly fair for them to hear both sides. So it's sort of like a debate, but not a debate, in the sense that he's already stated his views, and now we get to dissect them. So that is where we are at. I'm going to get that started. I'm going to switch so that you only see him and not me during this. And then when we're through, guess what, guys? I'm back and we can go through the PowerPoint. So let me switch us over to him with the disclaimer that if you're joining us now, what you are hearing is Rabbi Tovia Singer's argument so that we can look at it.
I believe, as an Orthodox Jew, is in Rabbinic Judaism. I engage in a debate. There's really a very fine gentleman in Sydney, going back, I don't know, quite a few months ago, and he actually introduced me to the audience as someone who believes in Rabbinic Judaism. As an Orthodox Jew, first point, he's a very, very nice fellow. I have a lot of respect for him, but, I was going, what are you talking about? In my mind. But that's not just a term that's used respectfully. It's a term to convey that what the Jews believe is in Rabbinic Judaism. It's not literally from the Bible. And then when these very same missionaries who claim, I can prove to you that Jesus is the promised Jewish Messiah from your Bible, if what I'm saying is foreign to you, you've been living in an igloo. This is a central core claim of groups like Jews for Jesus. This is what Chosen People Ministries insists. This is what the Assemblies of God claims. This is the point of the church. I could prove to you from your Old Testament that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Well, when we look up these supposed verses and passages, what we're faced with is clumsy mistranslations. Sometimes they're not so clumsy, but rather they're well thought out contrivances. And then they go, oh, Matthew was engaging rabbinic exegesis. But you told me from the beginning that that form of exegesis is illegitimate. That was your whole claim. So what they're doing is the church is insisting that I could prove to you from your Old Testament, this is their words, that Jesus is the promised Messiah. If you, not just any Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, if you would only open your own Jewish Bible and read Isaiah 9, you'd find Jesus there all over the place. He's bouncing off every page of Jeremiah. Again, if you really didn't hear this, then you did not enjoy the great pleasure of talking to a missionary. This will come up within seconds, okay? And they will distinguish their beliefs, meaning evangelicals will distinguish their own beliefs from that of Jews by saying we believe in only the Scripture. But then when they get in trouble, then when they're playing hide the football and we suddenly see it, they go, no, they were engaging in rabbinic exegesis. So which is it? So this is it's not just a torturous, this is a childish argument. It's a silly argument. It's one that has was never able to garner respect because it's contradictory. Moreover, if you are going to use some sort of this elastic midrashic exegesis in order to interpret text, in order to get what you believed, your theology, then what form of religion can be dismissed? Meaning, evangelical Christians reject the Church of the Latter-day Saints, its core teachings. Why should you reject it? They reject the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. They can't stand the Roman Catholic Church because they believe in all sorts of ideas and they have all sorts of tenets like Mariology, you could pray to Mary, and that the Pope actually has authority directly from God and he's a vicar of Christ and all this stuff, and it's literally that the body, that the wafer and the wine is literally the body and blood of Christ. Look, you know all this stuff. So anybody can argue then that, you have to use midrashic interpretations. Then you could say Irenaeus was using midrashic interpretations. Then you could say, that everything's possible. Then, then Augustine was using, and Justin, we're all using a midrashic interpretation. That means everything is possible, and it doesn't work that way. We have a principle, ein mikra yotze ela midei pshuto, and that is that a verse can never depart from its simple central meaning. So when we are told about a tenet in the church that is completely, utterly antithetical to the very principles that were promulgated by the prophets of Israel, we have to run from it. So when we're told by the church that the Eucharist, what a beautiful teaching this is, the idea that we are supposed to eat the body of the Messiah and drink his blood, the Eucharist is old, really old. The Eucharist is not from the 18th century. The Eucharist finds its way into the oldest surviving writings of the Christian Bible, not just the Gospel. I can walk that back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We find the Passover supper right there. Eating the body of the Messiah, drinking his blood. Look, if you want to ask me a question, what would it take for me to be a Christian? It's really simple. All you have to do is find me a verse like that in the book of Numbers, find me the doctrine of the Trinity in the book of Deuteronomy. Just find something that says that, and we'd all be in church. We're not insane. So it's not just that someone is using some midrashic interpretation. It's the very opposite. The idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are engaging in this, when in reality, we know what they're doing. They're misquoting the Bible. They're engaging in eisegesis, which means taking a passage out of context and ignoring or jettisoning the surrounding passages. They literally interpolate words that just aren't there. For example, Matthew 2, verse 6, a horrible misquote of Micah chapter 5, verse 2 in a Christian Bible, 5:1 in a Jewish Bible. It means you just cut off the end and just put something else in there. This is criminal behavior. This is not an interpretation. And they got away with it, frankly, because Christians are never taught the Hebrew language. Moreover, they're not really encouraged to study the Jewish scriptures. They talk a lot about it, but they don't really. They talk about the Bereans who went and searched through the Bible to find out the truth of Jesus, but they don't really do that. Christians are not really studying numbers, and whatever they do study of numbers, and you do have a few studious ones, they're reading Jesus right into it. So they're sort of reverse engineering it back into the Torah. So therefore, the claim in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15, where Joseph is told that he needs to take his family from Bethlehem, and they have to go down to Egypt and be there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. Okay? Now, where does it say that? That comes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. If you have a Christian study Bible and you looked up Matthew 2, verse 15, it would tell you that this phrase, out of Egypt have I called my son, is found in Hosea 11:1. I'm not making this up, and I didn't sneak into your house and put it in the footnote. Okay, it's there. Now, when we go back to Hosea 11, verse 1, it's very obvious. It's not even referring to going into Egypt. It's referring to going out of Egypt. It means the text says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him, and out of Egypt have I called my son. That's not midrashic use. That's, that's three-card Monty. That's the kind of thing you see people on the streets of London and New York setting up with, and you're trying to find the ace of spades while you're losing all your money.
Okay, we're back. I'm sorry the volume was a little low.
Etc. So
you probably heard his claim. So let's bring that claim up. He's claiming that really what you have here is an abuse by the New Testament writers of the Hebrew Scriptures. This is a common claim by Does Singer. Notice that he called the Bible the Christian Bible. We're going to talk a little bit about history, and you want to talk about three-card Monty. How about historical revisionism, which we're going to end up talking about? How are they abusing or misinterpreting the Hebrew Scriptures? Well, they're using a false and maybe deceptive interpretive technique. Before I go any further, you need to understand that Matthew is not trying to prove Jesus is the Messiah with messianic prophecy. He's trying to assure his Jewish audience that already believes Jesus is the Messiah that they're indeed in the right community. And so that's the first thing. Second of all, you couldn't prove much of anything about Messiah if you looked at those verses and you didn't give them an eschatological significance. In other words, a star shall rise out of Jacob. What does that mean on a literal level? That a star will come out of Jacob? In other words, we're talking about a planetary phenomena. Obviously, we're talking about the genre that was being used. And obviously, we're talking about a star rising out of Jacob. Is that a near future event or a far future event? So when you're dealing with messianic prophecy, you have to understand the way messianic prophecy works. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a lot of the claims that the Talmud makes about Messiah are totally unsubstantiatable if you were to go ahead and make the claim that Rabbi Tovia Singer makes. So there are a few things that he says that are a little hyperbolic and certainly out of line. Even with the rabbinical writings. And that's why when I've done some stuff on prophecy, I've gone to the Jewish writings themselves. Those writings that were done by those evangelical Protestants like the Talmud and the Targumim and the Dead Sea Scrolls, those basic Protestant writings that he's discussing. So true scholarship looks at the writings related to the period and other earlier translations. The Dead Sea Scrolls we're going to talk about, but the Targumim were Aramaic translations of the Bible that were fully accepted in the synagogues in Jesus's day. And they were not Protestant writings, which brings us to our first point tonight that we're going to get to fairly quickly. But the first thing we have to do, I wanted to give those disclaimers because he's making some statements themselves that are a little bit outside the pale of what would be good scholarship. Let's interrogate his point of view here for a few seconds and ask some questions. Because the way to look at a worldview or claim is to ask questions of that claim. So let's see how straight this really works. Here's the first question. Since the majority of New Testament writers were practicing a sect of Judaism, why treat their writings as writings of a distinctly different religion? Notice he constantly says the Christians, the Christian Bible, to distance the historic connection between Judaism and Christianity. We're going to look at whether that's historic revisionism and really a historical form of three-card Monty. Does sola scriptura, which he quotes, interestingly enough, it's probably one of the few Latin phrases he might know, mean that we have to ignore the historical setting and context of verses? He makes the statement that if anything disagrees with the plain meaning of the verse, the Talmud and rabbinical writings are full of interpretations that go beyond the plain meaning of the verse, and he accepts those. One of the examples is the kosher laws. Nowhere does it ever say you can't eat milk and meat together. The plain text doesn't say it. It can't be inferred from the plain text. In fact, Abraham serves 3 angels milk and meat together. So, might have been pre-Sinai, but the point is you have a hard time saying thou shalt not eat milk and meat together without a certain amount of time between the eating therein. Find that exact verse. So to say that you can only go ahead by the plain meaning of the text, that's not Judaism, even by any stretch of the imagination. So does sola scriptura, which is what he's holding us to, mean we have to ignore the historic setting and context? Were the New Testament writers using the Hebrew scriptures in a way inconsistent with existing methods of usage? In other words, is this three-card Monty or isn't it? So let's start talking through some of this stuff. I want to share what Rabbi Singer doesn't want you to know about history. So let's talk about what he doesn't want you to know about history. Rabbi Singer doesn't want you to know that Christianity was considered a sect of Judaism when it started. He wants to make Christianity something that are heard later on. It's a separate religion. It's got no connections to Judaism. It started in 300 with Constantine, or it started by Paul, who created a new religion out of nothing. He just woke up at a certain time, created a new religion. And so let's take a look at this deliberate historical revisionism. Okay? This is out of the Jewish Encyclopedia by Isidore Singer, something that it seems Rabbi Singer has not bothered to read as of yet. For a long time, Christianity regarded itself as a part of Judaism. It had its center in Jerusalem. Irenaeus, he's quoting a church father, Adversus Heresias, volume 1, 126, Its first 15 bishops were circumcised Jews. Wow. This foreign religion had Jewish people who were still considered Jews, noted by the church fathers as being Jews, noted by this Jewish encyclopedia as being Jews. They observed the law and were unfriendly to heathenism. Seriously. So his comments about Protestantism and this being a new religion are historic revisionism. And that's the first problem. A Judaism that has to rewrite history in order to make its point is really a form of three-card Monte to begin with. Okay? This is cherry-picking data at the very least and ignoring very clear scholarship even on the part of Jews. But let's go to the Jewish prayer book, something that Rabbi Singer would have to regard as a Protestant writing. This is Sidur Simchat HaYehoshua Li Yemot HaKol, Sidur for weekends with interlinear translation out of Brooklyn, New York, Mizora Publications, 2002, verse 142. The blessing, this is the blessing against the heretics, was composed in response to the threat of heretical Jewish sex. I'm sorry, Protestant sex? No, that's not what the note on this particular malediction in the Shemona Esrei says. Jewish sex. Let's look at these sects. The Sadducees. I'm not going to bother pronouncing the Bohuthians. The Essenes, well, you know, we obviously know that there's the first Essene Protestant church around the corner, and the early Christians. So let's see how this really worked. The early Jewish followers of Jesus were considered a sect of Judaism. They were forced out of the synagogue. Okay. By the Jewish leadership putting a curse in the Jewish prayer book. Okay. So, sounds like someone is calling something the Christian Bible. Well, it's not the Christian Bible, okay? The writers of most of what he calls the Christian Bible were practicing what was then a sect of Judaism and were Jews themselves, okay? Conclusion: we can't honestly treat the New Testament writers, especially the early writings, as writings of a distinctly different religion, since most of the New Testament writers were practicing a sect of Judaism. Come on, Rabbi, let's get historical, because if you can't be historical, you're probably not being very biblical. Now let's look at Sola Scriptura, which he pulls out of the Reformation, and he thinks he understands it. I should have posted a link, and I might try to get it for you, to the Chicago Statement of Hermeneutics. And if I have a few minutes after the broadcast, I'll try to pull that up real quick. It's probably one of the best statements on Bible interpretation I've ever seen. I pulled from it here. The literal sense of Scripture is strongly affirmed here. To be sure, the English word literal carries some problematic connotations with it. Hence, the words are normal and grammatical historical are used to explain what is meant. The literal sense is also designed to be more descriptive. A more descriptive title, grammatical historical. This means the correct interpretation is one that discovers the meaning of the text in its grammar forms and historic cultural context in which the text is expressed. In other words, Rabbi, the text can't say something other than what it means, but it can't mean something other than what it says to the people at the time it's being used. So when you look at the New Testament writings, and they're using Old Testament scripture, how was the Hebrew scriptures used in that day? So his uses of Sola Scriptura is ridiculous. He makes several claims about prophecies. that I could totally destroy. There's a video dealing with the virgin birth. And he says, well, the word virgin isn't there. Well, that's a ridiculous statement. The word there is not there in the sense that there's no Hebrew word for virgin. So it's like saying, well, the word television doesn't appear in the Bible, therefore no one ever viewed anything. It's a ridiculous argument. Does the authorial meaning convey the possibility of virgin is the question that must be asked. So sola scriptura doesn't mean, you can't use sola scriptura by looking at the English word virgin and saying, well, the word virgin in Hebrew isn't there. These Christians don't know Hebrew. Those of us that know Hebrew know there isn't a Hebrew word for a virgin intacta. Okay? So we look at the historical background and we look how the writers are using it and whether that was normative for the time being. But that's a silly argument. The word Messiah as a unique person who's coming might be more difficult to find than he thinks. And so we have to be careful with those sorts of arguments. They aren't good scholarship. Sola Scriptura takes into account the historic setting of any text. To say otherwise is committing what's called a straw man fallacy. He's misstating the case. What was understood when the prophecy was given and what could be understood from that prophecy later is a different question than whether our English Bible, translated from the Masoretic text, happens to say those exact things. So let's see if the New Testament writers are playing hard and fast with the text. And by the way, as I said, there's no lack. There is no lack of evidence that you can have a wider meaning to the text than just the plain literal text. There is one response there. Messiah is a big thing, but Messiah's picture develops over time. That's the way the Messianic hope works. So it's not a matter of a big thing or not a big thing. It's a matter of the hope gets clearer as you go. And we can spend some time with the rules around Messianic prophecy. This is Dr. Brown. Now, Dr. Brown is actually quoting Joseph A. Fitzmyer in his essays on the Semitic background of the New Testament. Scholar Press, 1979, pages 17 and 18. Okay. And so that's where we're sort of at here. This is a scholar. You can't just poo-poo scholarship because you don't like what it says. Okay? He's going to point out the way the Essenes used biblical text during the day, one of the sects of Judaism. And so were there people that were using the text in a way similar? Well, we're going to take a look at this. I want to explain what a Essene is. I've already joked about it. The idea that every other sect who did anything like what the New Testament writers did is somehow a Protestant sect is really sort of ridiculous. So let's just take care of this. This, again, is from the Dictionary of Jewish Words. Joyce Eisenberg and Ellen Skolnick. This is a Jewish Publication Society, by the way. And it's page 40. Essene, Hebrew, a member of a monastic Jewish sect that lived in ancient Israel in Qumran near the Dead Sea during the time of the Second Temple, 538, and they mean to say before the Common Era, 270 CE. Okay? Essenes did not marry, and they lived apart from mainstream society. They had very strict rules governing every aspect of daily life, including hygiene, eating, and studying. It is believed that the Essenes were the scribes and perhaps the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's good reason to believe that. So if you understand the Essenes as the writer of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would be doing a good job. Now, He's making the comment that the usages you see of the New Testament writers as far as their usage of the Old Testament is a strictly Christian phenomena. Well, let's see. Now, we're not talking Talmudic methods of interpretation. We're talking the way a Jewish sect used the scriptures prior to the codification of the Babylonian Talmud. And we're not talking about the acronym, which he mentions in his thing, which is the acronym used for rabbinical interpretation. We're talking about just generally how the Bible could be interpreted. Fitzmyer calls and he looks at the four classes of the way the Essenes made use of Tanakh, the text of the Hebrew Scriptures, when they wanted to highlight something or point something out or make a point. And he calls the first class of quotations the literal or historical class. Now, this is the just plain bare sense meaning, okay? He describes it in citations which appear in Qumran. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, Christian Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, considered Christian Bible. I'm sorry, I viewed the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Shrine of the Book in Israel. There was no thing stating that these were uniquely Christian writings. This is in which the Qumran author quotes the Old Testament in the same sense it was used in the original writing. Now that's what Rabbi Singer wants to hold us to. Okay? Now even the Talmud and rabbis didn't do that. But even before the Talmud's codified, the Essenes didn't do just that. Now there are examples where this first sense is used. He ends up going to one of the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which quotes numbers. But it does in the normal, average, bare bone way it could have been understood in that day. Does the New Testament have examples? Yeah. John 6:31, quoting Psalm 78:24. So do the New Testament writers make use of this sense of the scriptures? Yes, they do. Let's look at the next class. It's labeled the class of modernized texts. Now, he doesn't mean that he's being slipshod or modern or anything. Okay? In which the words of the Old Testament refer to a specific in their original text, but nevertheless vague enough in themselves to be used by the Qumran author for some new event or contemporary scene. In other words, the same general sense of the Old Testament is preserved, but it is applied to a new subject. I don't know why I stopped streaming. Okay. Okay, we're back. There's going to be some glitches tonight. I'm sure that there's somebody who doesn't want this completed this evening. So hang out with me. I really wish our high speed was better, but God's going to have to provide that, and I don't know a way to do that. This is the next class of text. So if it freezes a little bit, there's something going on in the neighborhood. But hopefully we'll get this back. Good old Cox is doing wonders for me this evening by doing this, and I don't know why. We have had monsoons in the area, so I'm going to try to keep going with this. This is the one problem with live, and I like live because I have you guys here. Mar, if anybody's on the internet, get them off. Okay? Because all of a sudden, I've lost everything. Okay. Just a word to the folks. We're sharing here. I don't know. I think I'm back. So I'm getting bad. There's going to be some buffering. Sorry. Let's just keep moving and hope that God will just zap the line with a little added something this evening. Where do these occur? Well, he cites the Qumran text quoting Hosea 4:6. For a New Testament text, we can see Isaiah 9:1 and a few other places. Are the New Testament writers using the scriptures? Well, they're using the scriptures as the way at least one Jewish sect used them. And not different, not all that outlandishly from what would be used. You have to understand the way this ends up working. The New Testament writers saw Messiah as being the ultimate fulfillment, okay, as being the ultimate Israel. And so it was not uncommon for them, seeing it that way, to do that. Now, the Qumran group had a way of seeing that the scriptures applied back then, but they had application to today. And the idea that the scriptures prophecy can't refer to a future event in some sort of greater way is absolutely ridiculous, because by that standard, he couldn't apply those texts to today if he was going to apply that standard. At least not from what I could see. It would be very difficult to say something was happening today and try to go ahead and do that without trying to apply an ancient text that was understood a certain way at the time it was given, and see a greater meaning to it and apply it to a later event. So his argument backfires against a future Messiah the same way it backfires against the New Testament writers ultimately. But let's just keep moving. Okay, this is that. Now, it's not exactly the same as this is that, but it's sort of like it. The next class is called accommodated texts, which Fitchmeyer explains has in common with the modernized text the application to a new situation. So it has that in common. However, it differs from the Old Testament text in the case that it is usually wrested from the original context or modified somehow to suit the new situation. Who was doing this? These were the Essenes, which were a sect of Judaism, not 3rd century Christian writers, not Protestants, but Jewish individuals during the time of the New Testament writers. Go figure. Now, there's an eschatological class of text, which is exactly what the New Testament writers also do. They usually express the Old Testament context, a promise or a threat about something still to be accomplished in the eschaton. Folks, prophecy is about future events. The prophet may have meant it about a event in his day, but that doesn't mean that God didn't have the intent to fulfill that in a greater way later on. And Rabbi Singer has to prove that prophecy can't have a greater meaning in the future, or can't be used to point or to explain something that is outside of the strict usage of the most literal use of the text. And until he can do that, he doesn't really have a claim. These are Essenes. Okay, by the way, I've left up Dr. Brown's references. To summarize, the use of the Tanakh in the New Covenant writings finds many parallels in the usage of the Hebrew Scriptures or Tanakh in the Qumran writings, in keeping with Jewish methods of biblical interpretation dating back to the 1st century, and maybe even earlier. In other words, a biblically literate Jew living in the 1st century era would not find the New Testament citations of Scripture to be outlandish. This isn't some bait and switch. This is the way that points would be made to a Jewish audience in the 1st century. And remember, I used to think Matthew was proving Jesus was the Messiah. Matthew is illustrating and demonstrating Jesus is the Messiah. You don't have to prove something that's true. Something is true if it's true, whether I can prove it or not. A better answer to Rabbi Singer might be, show me where the New Testament writers are departing from methods of interpretation that were used by other Jewish sects in the first century, and show me how the methods the New Testament writers use are somehow more outlandish than the way rabbinical sources use the texts of the Tanakh. That would be an honest appraisal of what New Testament writers are doing. So Rabbi Singer is going off, but he's ignoring history. He's ignoring examples of the usage of the Tanakh in the first century. And he is treating the New Testament writers as if they're writers of a totally foreign religion instead of writers within Judaism as part of a sect of Judaism that the rabbis later didn't like and kicked out, but that people in that day would have recognized as a sect of Judaism. After all, heresy is different than apostasy. By the way, I've said that. If a Jewish person turned to me and said, I'm a heretic, I would say, well, you're perfectly okay in thinking I'm a heretic. I could accept that. What you're not okay is in saying I'm apostate. I have not left the worship of the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I may differ with you as to the difference between interpretation under the rabbis and interpretation under my rabbi, Yeshua, who happens to be a lot more than just a rabbi. By the way, we will deal with whether Rabbi Singer is a rabbinical Jew and what it means to be a rabbinical Jew in another broadcast. So let's see if we could draw some conclusions from tonight. First of all, Rabbi Singer is guilty of the error or logical fallacy of false dichotomy because Christianity started as a Jewish sect and at its heart is Jewish. Therefore, trying to make Christians some Gentile other religion and Judaism over here is a false dichotomy and it is a logical fallacy. He also commits the error of strawman fallacy in his misunderstanding of sola scriptura. That's all we say in sola scriptura is that when Matthew is writing or quoting a biblical text, he is doing so within the limits of the understanding of the people as far as that text and the way it could be used. And when we look at the prophetic authors, we understand the text in terms of what that author was trying to say and allow that it could have future implications in line with what that author was trying to say that that author may not have understood at that time. So he is misusing and creating a straw man argument out of sola scriptura that he really has no right to go ahead and claim. And so that's where my problem with Rabbi Singer sort of is. He is sort of doing a three-card Monte himself, in the sense that he's hiding some truths of history as far as the use of the Hebrew scriptures and even the fact that Christianity started as a Jewish sect from his audience and downplaying it. He's also a little disingenuous in trying to separate and say, well, it's only the Protestants and treating the Protestants as some sort of abnormality. And I dare say he may be tempted to do this because Catholics and Anglicans are not very active in sharing the gospel. By the way, Jewish believers were not actively a force to be reckoned with during the Reformation. So technically, it's a little bit historically disingenuous to kind of make us like a big, huge group during the Reformation. And so he does some things with history that are ahistorical, to say the least, and slightly deceptive, to say the most. So that's where we find ourselves. I kind of hope this gets out. The only problem is I kind of wish he had been a little louder during that time period, but I think we got the gist of his argument. And I just have to play around with settings. So, thank you guys for tuning in. Get this video to some other people. I think that some of this is really worthwhile to understand the way the New Testament writers deliberately used the Hebrew scriptures in line with the way other groups of Jews were using the Hebrew scriptures to make points or to illustrate in their day arguments. And by the way, some of the authorial intent, the usage of the Hebrew scriptures by the New Testament writers is not contrary. It's in line with the way people were talking in that day. And so that's what needs to be understood. Now that we've taken into account history, we've taken into account the usage of scripture in the first century, we can say, and we even know that the Talmud goes far further than even the New Testament writers in their interpretation of Scripture. Rabbi, you need to play with equal weights and measures and be honest. And do a little bit of historical homework. So, let me pull up. Tonight's broadcast ended up being brought by a few additional folks. Malachi is on board. I do want to go ahead and remind you that yes, I am guilty of being involved with Chosen People. That funny group of Protestants that he wants to make a group who followed and were around during the Reformation period, but we really weren't. If you don't support us through Chosen People Ministries, you can do so through Patreon, and there's a list of our patrons so far. Hey, definitely subscribe to the station. Help encourage other people to do it. Definitely go ahead and like the video. And definitely consider becoming a patron if you don't support us through Chosen People. Well, it was great having you here. I'm sorry about any glitches, but this is the world. And maybe that's just further proof that Rabbi Singer needed to be challenged this evening. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to pull, as these credits are going, real quickly the Chicago Statement on hermeneutics and put it in there. In fact, what I'll do is I'll cut the feed and I'll try to grab that for you real quick and put that in. Try to stay with me. I think I get about 10 minutes. So, okay.